Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, of course, I am from the ABC, so I would like to say at the beginning that while it's a great pleasure to be here, I have an obligation to be balanced, so it's also not a great pleasure to be here. And I would also like to start by acknowledging at this conference about integrity how truly inappropriate it is for me to be here at all. A reminder to everyone that the hashtag for today's event is hashtag Integrity20, and you can use that throughout the whole conference, but today's session as well, to ask questions, and we'll do our best to incorporate those questions into the discussion with our very esteemed panel, who I'll introduce now. Obviously, John Hewson needs no introduction because he's already had one. And I was reflecting while I heard John's speech that living in the era of Donald Trump, it just really made me nostalgic for the days when someone like John was the bad guy in politics. I mean, how far we've come. To John's left, which I think we can always say, we have, or maybe not so much these days, we have Professor Rae Langton. Rae is the Knightsbridge Professor of Philosophy at the University of Cambridge. Rae was listed in Prospect Magazine's list of 50 World Thinkers 2014, which was voted. I'm not sure what I think about a voted list of thinkers, but and I haven't checked her 2016 rankings, I must say, but she's she's an esteemed figure in public discourse and academia. And she's here today straight off the plane from a 15-hour flight from Dubai. So not just post-truth, but post-flight. So we welcome her very much. Susan Forde is the Associate Professor and Director of the Griffith Centre for Social and Cultural Research. So her carbon footprint is significantly lighter than Rae's, you'd have to say. And Susan's the co-founding editor of the Journal of Alternative and Community Media. And then we have Nick Enfield, who is, I love this title, the head of the Post-Truth Initiative, which sort of suggests this is all your fault, Nick, I've got to say, but at Sydney University. Nick's a professor of linguistics and also the director of the Sydney Social Sciences and Humanities Advanced Research Centre, acronym SHARC, which I love. So we're here today to discuss the pursuit of truth, but I think more crucially, this whole notion of post-truth, which is extraordinarily commonly used phrase at the moment. It's not just a zeitgeisty cliche, it was actually recognised by the Oxford English Dictionary as the word of the year last year. And the reason that the OED chose for nominating post-truth is because they said that the idea of moving beyond truth is now a generalised characteristic of our age. So I wanted to begin by asking all our panellists, do you agree that the idea of moving beyond truth is a generalised characteristic of our age? And why do you think this might have happened, if you agree? We'll start. Rae, would you like to start?
Well, I don't think people literally mean that there's no more truth, because, you know, we've still got the glasses on the table, the beer is in the fridge, and the bus leaves at 7 o'clock. So it's, all those sorts of things are still true. So we're not giving up on truth literally. But the concern, and why it was the word of the year in the OED, was because of people not bothering to care about truth enough. In fact, to the extent that you're concerned that people are lying too much and that there's fake news, that presupposes that there is such a thing as truth that we ought to be aiming at. So post-truth is, it's a bit like concern about the boy who cried wolf. The thought that someone's saying something false, and that has the capacity to infect his own credibility, but also affect the trust in the system much more generally. That's not a definition, that's just some remarks, really.
That's right.
Don't expect better than that from me after a 15-hour, actually 24-hour flight.
Wow, gosh.
Yeah, if you count from London. Okay.
Nick, from the perspective of a linguist, what do you make of the term post-truth? And Do you believe it's a characteristic of our age?
Well, I strongly agree with Rae when it comes to the sort of question of how much of our lives is actually affected by this post-truth idea.
Yep.
So there's a lot of conversation in sort of academic settings about postmodernism kind of affecting the way we think and infecting the news and public discourse. And that's important, but in our everyday lives we do all of these things like plan to get on a bus or many other things, but I think also importantly in our social relationships we expect that people are going to be telling us the truth, not tricking us, not deceiving us. So there's a large sort of part of our lives that still really is sort of built around trust and so forth, but the issue of kind of post-truth growing in public discourse is probably a little bit alarming if it signals that that kind of side of our lives could be somehow affected. I mean, as for the term post-truth, it's one of those terms that can mean anything you like. Fake news is another one, and we've all seen how Trump's turned fake news into meaning something quite different, overnight.
John, in your speech, you clearly believe in the idea of being honest and having a factual basis for what you say. Do you still maintain that belief despite the ascendancy of someone like Donald Trump who appears not to care?
Well, I think it becomes even more important. I mean, you can say that these sort of sentiments perhaps go in waves, and in a sense, post-truth is an exaggeration to make a point, and it's making a point. I mean, what's the definition of fake news? It's anybody who says anything that disagrees with Donald Trump. It doesn't take too much to define it in the way that it's being used. But from my point of view, the drift away from a desire to generate proper evidence-based public policy is what my big concern. And that's allowed, and the short-termism that we now have in politics, it's a day-to-day contest, means that, ideas aren't going to last that long if they're contested or if there's a negative response. And so you don't get the opportunity to even have the incentive. I mean, a lot of academics say to me, why do I bother doing this detailed research? Because among my peer group, of course, it matters, but more broadly, it's not going to be taken at face value or accepted. And what worries me is that scientific method, to me, the essence of it is contestability. I mean, scientists have their own theories, their hypotheses, their research conclusions, and they contest each other's in order to advance the frontiers of knowledge. And to lose that momentum and to start naming and shaming scientists because they happen to argue a case for climate is, I think, an appalling outcome of this sort of era. So there are a lot of elements to it, but I mean, my basic motivation is evidence-based policy, and unfortunately that's just been undermined.
Susan, what do you think the role of both traditional media and other forms of media has been in either supporting or perhaps degrading the idea of truth and evidence?
Yeah, I think the media has actually played a really important role in all of this, in the sense that they haven't kept politicians perhaps as accountable as they might have in the past. There's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is the declining resources in the media. Media doesn't have, there's, one quarter of the Australian journalistic workforce has been removed in the past 5 or 6 years. That's a lot of journalism positions gone. So a lot of media organisations don't have the resources anymore to do their job as well as they could do it or should do it. And I think that's important. There was some work, media research, even 10, 20 years ago, which started identifying the notion of the journalist as stenographer. The journalist who is simply copying out what politicians or people in power are saying and reporting it to the people as though they're just the messenger. That's not always been the notion of what journalism and media are supposed to be about. There is supposed to be some level of analysis and judgment about what's going on here, and particularly judgment about what the people should know, and questioning. So what we see now is a lot of politicians making statements that the journalists themselves know to be incorrect, know to be a lie, a post-truth, but they let it happen and they just report it as though it's just their role to simply put it out there. And there was a good recent case, I think, with Tony Abbott's comments about climate change might not be that bad after all because, people won't die from cold snaps anymore. I mean, it's just ludicrous. And that got blanket coverage, and he really wasn't held to account for that. And I think that's part of the problem when you think about post-truth and media.
Nick, John certainly seems to maintain a belief that if you state the fact, and that at some level will be compelling to people eventually, which is, I suppose, a belief over and over again. Yeah, exactly. Till you vomit in politics, the vomit principle. Yeah. How much faith can we put into human rationality and the belief that most people over time will accept something if it's true?
I think this goes to the core of the problem, actually. There's a lot of serious problems with human
Sorry, that was
rationality.
accidental.
No, it's a great question precisely because there's a lot of problems with human rationality that we know a fair bit about. There's a lot of work in cognitive science on how people make decisions, how people evaluate evidence, and we know that we use all sorts of shortcuts and all sorts of biases that oftentimes work pretty well, but actually what they do is they don't, what we do when we think, when we evaluate the evidence we have before us in everyday life is we don't exhaustively weigh up all the options. We don't go and check all the facts. We rely on some rules of thumb in everyday life that allow us to kind of make quick decisions and so on. And the problem is when we transfer that into, realms where we actually can't grasp all the evidence, where we can't see the consequences directly, things like climate change and things like that, it becomes very hard for us to actually push ourselves to do the things that are necessary, like evaluate all the evidence seriously and so on. So there's actually a serious problem with us as agents, if you like, as thinkers, us as decision makers on the individual level. And part of what has to be done is, beyond sort of getting the information out there, is changing the habits of people to really learn to catch themselves when they're sort of, not thinking very well, or they're making decisions in a kind of a, loosey-goosey kind of way. That's actually one of the great challenges, which I think has to go hand in hand with getting reliable information out there.
So you're saying you think that a level of self-awareness means that you can be almost like the scientific process is supposed to be self-correcting in some way?
Yeah, it's a kind of a cognitive literacy, if you like, that people really need to, that I think we really need to promote.
That's at an individual level.
I was going to suggest that it's all very well to have media literacy, but if there are structural problems which mean that the facts just aren't going to get out there, and also it's not just a matter of media literacy whether or not we find it fun to read the facts. So this is part of the issue. So as you know, and we've already had some rather sad references to the recent events in British politics, including the Brexit referendum. But when I was looking into that, I found something which I didn't even know existed, which is that the EU has a massive database of Euromyths. So for every Euromyth, the EU is going to stop Bramley apples counting as apples because you can't eat them raw, or the EU is going to call this a non-banana because it's too bendy, or the EU is going to call this non-chocolate because it's got not enough cocoa in it. So for all of the, I'm not going to pin them all on Boris Johnson, but there was a huge number. I mean, there was just this tremendous habit for decades, actually, of just making fun of the EU at every opportunity. And, faithful fact-checkers in the EU collected them all, and they're all out there on this EU myth-busting website. Only unlike some myth-busting websites, it's almost unknown. And I think that's partly a structural issue, as well as an issue about sort of individual responsibility and media literacy. So there are different things to put in the picture. And I don't know, yes, I know we're supposed to be thinking about solutions, but there are grounds for... So we've heard the optimistic voice here and the grounds for pessimism here.
John?
I've just heard a very good explanation for why a large percentage of the UK wanted to leave.
Absolutely.
That list of...
Yeah.
Look, I think that a lot of technology has been very disruptive, and it's been disruptive in the media area in particular. It's undermined traditional media. Things like people getting a larger number of people now getting their news online, or on a Twitter feed, or on a Facebook page, or whatever. And that has made it's made it a lot easier to run all sorts of arguments without evidence. And there's no discipline on those who anyone can be a news generator. And, you can trade that, and it has a big impact on traditional media and their capacity to continue to do what they did, but also it's been able to feed. You've seen campaigns run on social media that really have no factual base whatsoever, but they've been very effective because they reach a lot of people very quickly. And I think that's also had an impact on attitudes to government in the sense that everything's got more and more short-term and more instantaneous. Let's get an instantaneous quick fix for something. And that's actually very difficult to do in government. Yet the expectations are running away against what is possible.
Social media certainly seems to have been getting a very bad rap in terms of its impact on politics and all the discussion about the impact of fake news on the presidential election. Susan, I'd be interested in your thoughts on whether how much of a change social media has had as a technology on reliability and trust in media, and are we seeing something genuinely new, or just a high-tech version of something that's always happened?
Social media is really interesting. I mean, it's interesting from a media perspective in terms of how people get their information. It's also interesting in terms of how information is disseminated. So there's been a lot of research around about how, particularly at the beginning of social media, this was going to cause revolutions everywhere because a huge mass of people, potential protesters, activists, whoever it might be, could suddenly be reached very quickly, as John said, very quickly, blanket coverage, and certainly the beginnings of the Arab Spring and those sorts of large protest movements, the indignados, was put down to the ability of social media to gather large groups. So I think social media is interesting for that reason, the way it can potentially activate a public and enable people to more completely engage in their civic duties. In terms of the lineup between social media and traditional media, although many more people now are using social media to access news, social media is actually identified as a less trustworthy source of news than traditional media. So even though a lot of people's news is coming through their social media feeds, they don't trust news in social media, and this is specifically talking about news. They don't trust news coming through social media feeds as much as they trust news from traditional media outlets. And when I say traditional media outlets, I would particularly refer there, in our context in Australia, to public broadcasting especially. They trust commercial media, traditional commercial media, a lot less than they trust public service broadcasting. But they still, at the moment, people still trust, according to 2017 census data, they still trust traditional commercial media more than they would news coming through social media, which is interesting.
Right, yeah.
I would be interested to know whether what they say they trust and what they actually trust actually line up.
Yes.
Because we all know that we sort of soak up beliefs where if you said, oh, are you buying this shampoo because you've got good evidence that it's great shampoo? No, I just soaked up some bit of advertising somewhere. So I'd like to know whether or not people's reports of their own trust of the media actually matches up to what they do in fact trust. So, I mean, if in practice people are getting things from sort of, I don't know, the cheap speech, if you like, that rather than it's called free speech. I can say whatever I like, it's free speech, but you think of the sort of thing that was just being described as cheap speech because you haven't got to bother with fact-checking or anything. But if people are just soaking it up, that they might be getting a very large amount of their information from stuff that isn't even purporting to inform. So this is where the issue of sort of, backdoor speech acts comes in. People convey, for instance, that the idea of an immigration crisis without even purporting to do any facts, without even purporting to give any facts at all, or without. So, for instance, let's see. There was a tabloid newspaper headline that I saw when I was working with the Leveson inquiry on media ethics. So in the tabloid headline went something like this: asylum seekers barbecue the Queen's swans. Wow. So that, think of the subtext there. The swans. Of course, we all know, as good British people, that all swans in Britain belong to the Queen, except the ones that belong to St. John's College by special permission. But apart from that, so asylum seekers barbecue the Queen's swans. And so then the next thing to say, and this is from a philosophy of language point of view, is that you have a bare plural there, asylum seekers, and you're allowed to use that kind of bare plural in many different contexts. For instance, even if there was only one asylum seeker, you would be allowed to use an unquantified phrase like asylum seekers barbecue the Queen's swans. Anyway, it turned out that not even one, and it was some vague bird had been seen in some possible shopping basket by some person who was not an asylum seeker. But in any case, so this was one of the bits of fake news that was being discussed even before fake news was in the news. But anyway, I should stop there. I went on much too long because I got carried away with the asylum seekers. I think what I was wanting to emphasize was that a headline like that is, you might think this is not giving you facts about a whole class of people, but because it leaks into a kind of generic and stereotyping talk, you end up acquiring beliefs about a whole class of people. I'm going to be talking a bit about this when I talk about hate speech, in ways that were not even purporting to be evidence-based, but they're how we work, because we're fallible cognitive agents. So anyway, I didn't mean to get carried away.
Nika, yeah, and I'm interested in your response to Rae. I also wanted to ask you, what's the difference between, say, disputing Sean Spicer saying that that there were more people at the Trump inauguration than any previous inauguration, and respecting, for example, another person's belief in God, or can you meaningfully distinguish between those two
I think
things?
so. I mean, I think if you respect another person's belief in God, you're saying, I'm not going to hold you to account for giving me evidence for the belief that you say you have.
Yep.
And I think you get to a point where you're just not going to dispute that point. You're going to let them have that.
Someone should answer that, by the way.
Someone's phone is going off there. So there's a in our lives we're not going to dispute certain claims that people make, but there are different reasons why that might be. It might be, well, your faith in God is not going to affect me. You're going to make statements that I wouldn't make, but this is not going to. I can see you're not going to let that go, or it's not going to make any sort of difference to me. So I think there's reasons why you would or would not sort of, dispute a claim or question a claim in some contexts, but in others. But it points to, I think, an interesting thing that, coming back to what Rae was saying, is that, a belief in God is a good example that you accept it, you accept a statement like, God exists, partly because that's part of who you are, okay? Just being able to state that and to assert that as a belief of your own, it says something about your identity, right? And oftentimes,
I
people's...
don't agree at all.
Well,
Sorry.
Coming back to the...
Explain a little bit, and then we'll hear.
But coming back to these kinds of points about why you would accept something that is, published in the newspaper, there's something called a confirmation bias, which is that, you see something that agrees with something you already believe, and you're much more likely to accept it. And so, it's sort of there's a connection in a sense to the identity of the person who's making that statement. If somehow it's being said in the newspaper that you read, or it's supporting the views that you already have, then you're much more likely to accept it without any interest in evidence that might be offered.
Yeah.
And conversely, if it's something that you don't, or if it's pushing a line that you don't agree with, if it's in the service of an agenda that you don't agree with, as much evidence as you like can be presented, and you're just going to discount it. And I think that, we see that going all the time. The Trump statement about the people celebrating in New Jersey and dancing in the streets when the Twin Towers came down is a case of that. He just said in front of the cameras, journalists said to him, there's no evidence that happened. And he said, well, I know that it happened, okay? I know that it happened. And that was the end of it. So I think it comes back to the accountability problems and all of these things together.
It sounds like the Stephen Colbert concept of truthiness. Like I feel that is true.
Yeah.
In my heart, it feels
not
true.
accountable.
Yeah. Rae, it seems like you swung from disagreeing with Nick to agreeing during that statement.
That's because, okay, so I agree that confirmation bias is a huge problem, and part of what makes us extremely fallible epistemic agents. We love hearing the stuff that agrees with what we believe already. The bit that I was feeling slightly indignant about, I guess, it was the part about treating belief in God as in a completely different category to belief about the number of people who were actually there. You might, for reasons of politeness, not get into that, but it's a fact of the matter whether God exists or not, and it's up for argument and evidence and discussion, just like anything else. We spend lots of time arguing about those sorts of things in my corner of the world. But I think that what you were saying was really important, but I don't endorse it. It's a really important part of the problem, namely that people, when they think this is part of my identity, this is who I am, that somehow means, I haven't got to give any reasons for it because it's just me. Oh, I don't know, it's just me. Oh, that's just not me. That just is me. That's just giving up on the business of sort of trying to find out what might be worth doing for its own sake and why we might argue with each other and talk together and find out what might be worth doing for its own sake. So I just, I'm very resistant to the idea that we just respect sort of those kinds of identity claims in such a way that they prevent conversation.
Right. I didn't mean to discount that possibility in any way, but I guess I was pointing to, in your question, you were asking, well, what does it mean when you allow someone to sort of have a belief that you don't agree with? And I think that just in our lives, of course, we can have these conversations about whether God exists, but oftentimes, we don't get into that. We might have a conversation about whether the milk in the fridge is off or not. Right, and then that sort of matters more for the here and now as to whether I need to go down to the shop and get some before the guests arrive, or whatever the case may be. But I think a lot of the time in life, when we're worrying about the facts, we're worrying about we really do talk about the evidence for them and so forth. Let's smell it. Yes, it's off. No, it's not, and so forth.
I wanted to introduce now the idea of what ways out of these binds that there might be. Can we, in a time where strange things seem to be happening in electorates around the world, does the panel think that we can place our faith in democracy? John, do you have faith in democracy?
Well, I think so. You really need to ask yourself why the electorate's gone the way it's gone in a number of cases. And a lot of that's because of the fact that they've been left behind, or they've been ignored, or they've been taken for granted, or whatever the explanation is, and they're registering a protest against that, but they're using democratic processes to do that. Often, of course, you get a low voter turnout in a non-compulsory voting world. One of the reasons Trump got up is that the turnout was low, and all those independents and minorities that voted for Obama stayed home, and so he managed to squeak through at the bottom by winning the 4 Rust Belt states. But that, you could still say, is a democratic process, but he didn't win the popular vote, and and a significant percentage of people chose not to vote. But I think democracy is in question, and you have to think about, it's a work in progress. I think it's an evolutionary thing. You've got to keep thinking about how you make it work better or improve it. And to some extent, that's meeting the expectations and aspirations of the voter. And to the extent that you don't do that, in our system we have compulsory voting. So they don't like Liberal and Labor, they're voting minority wherever they can, alternative, independent, Green, whatever, to register a protest. Not expecting, for example, that they will actually end up in government. I mean, you're about to have an election in Queensland, I think, probably an early election. You know, Pauline Hanson stands to do pretty well. And a lot of people will register a vote against Liberal and Labor in this state, in my view, the full expectation that she won't have to govern. And one of the things that happened with Trump is I think there was a fair bit of that protest behind him, and he actually won.
And with Brexit.
And now you're looking at, well, he doesn't know how to do it, he can't govern. Xenophon today is in the paper in South Australia is more popular than the two alternative candidates for Premier. And if you think about that, do you really want Nick Xenophon to be Premier? Or do you want him to hold the balance of power and hold the others to account? So democracy sometimes goes too far in expressing its view. I remember a few years ago when Kennett was thrown out. I mean, there was a desire at the electorate level shown up in so many polls and so on that people wanted to, you know, give him a kick in the backside. They didn't expect that they'd kick him out. And that's what happened. The same thing happened here in Queensland last time. You know, sometimes the protest actually gets some momentum and democracy produces an outcome that I guess the majority of people at a second chance wouldn't take. I think Brexit, if you'd run a vote again, they wouldn't have voted that way because they would have started to focus on the consequences of the process that had begun. So I'm still a great believer in democracy, but Churchill was right. You know, it's the least worst of all the other systems that have been tried. But you know, so I think I'd rather try and make it work than go to more of a dictatorship or some other form of structure. To collective, you know, leadership or whatever that is harder to put into place and to sustain.
Susan, do you think the institutions of democracy are up to the challenge of technological change and the spread of information and disinformation?
Yeah, look, not as they stand, I don't think. And just to pick up on you know, why people are sort of using their democratic rights to register so much protest and to register against major parties and those sorts of things. I think people like Trump and here in Australia like Hanson and the major figures in Brexit, they come across and present themselves as the anti-politician. You know, we are not like those others that have been pulling the wool over your eyes for years. I'm an ordinary person like you. I own a fish and chip shop at Ipswich, or I used to. I was a businessman. And so they present themselves as the non-politician, you know, the anti-politician. And if people are voting for that, that is making a statement about what faith they have in democracy and what faith they've had in the processes that we've seen today. So I think voting for those people who are presenting themselves as the anti-politician or the non-politician is certainly a protest against democracy, you know, and the way it's gone, and certainly against the notion of the professional politician. I think what Trump has done very successfully is to not only identify a political elite, which is the professional politician, but then to throw the media in with that as well. So he has the political elite and the media elite. And we're seeing that, and they're in cahoots with each other. So you can't trust any of them, is his message to the public. You can trust me, but you can't trust them because they're in cahoots together. And we see that same dialogue now and narrative used by Turnbull. So Malcolm Turnbull is using that term, the media elite, as a way to discredit you know, whether it's journalistic opinion or media coverage that is not agreeing with what they're putting forward. That's dangerous.
Rae, you were part of the Leveson inquiry. You gave evidence to the Leveson inquiry.
Well,
I'm interested in your thoughts on the combination of media and democracy.
So, I mean, part of your question is about remedies.
Yeah.
Can I just say a bit more about the problem
Sure,
first?
please.
Because and I'm not sure if this was implicit in how John was framing it or not, but the more fake news there is, or the more post-truth we get, the less democracy there is. So this is based on the very simple idea that democracy depends on choice, and choice depends on knowledge. And knowledge, of course, depends on truth. So when you go to the doctor, and you are offered some complicated operation, and you sign the form without looking at all the small print, and you find out, uh-oh, I thought I was signing up for a biopsy and it's an amputation. Sorry, this is not a metaphor for Brexit exactly, but
Pretty close.
it's not bad. That is, so if you did not give your informed consent, there's a sense in which it was not consent. So this idea is a very familiar one, that if you don't know what you're choosing, you're not really choosing. And this applies in politics as everywhere else. That's why the media is so important in enabling us to know what's going on, keeping the bastards honest, speaking truth to power, all that stuff. And yeah, the Brexit bus, the £350 million a week that was going to be clawed back from the EU and spent on the NHS, which was ditched, of course, the minute the referendum was over. So that's like the fake news in the small print that your unscrupulous doctor gives you. Anyway, the point is, if you don't know what's going on, then you're not choosing it. So it's just not a democracy in the first place. Now, what to do about that? Well, we have to, first of all, assume that we're extremely fallible agents in the way that Nick has been bringing out, and think about ways to combat that, and think about what structural institutions could work. But I've talked too much about the problem. I should let some other people think about the solutions.
Nick, do you think that a society or an institution like democracy can sort of replicate that sense of awareness that you were talking about at the individual level, of being conscious of your own fallibility?
Yeah, I would hope so. I think you have to have faith in education and the idea that you can sort of get people to see certain mechanisms. I mean, there's a couple of things, and one of them is about government. Really, is just understanding how it works and what the consequences are of your action. I mean, it's just mind-blowing when you think about it, that you can, sort of register a protest vote, and yet, by doing so, make decisions that are very strongly against your own interest, and especially given this idea that you've got a politician saying, don't trust those elites, trust me, and yet this is a person with no experience, just as you were saying. So, in your doctor surgery example, I think there was a nice cartoon about Trump with sort of an airplane pilot sort of thing, saying, airplane pilot elites, well, let's not trust them, I'll fly this plane. Of course, we're not going to, let a random passenger go up and fly the plane because, they think that they'd be better at it, right? So what's really intriguing to me and completely puzzling is why is that happening in democracy in these examples that we've just kind of looked at?
I think this thrust for outsiders, looking for the Messiah or somebody to come in and actually make a fundamental difference, drain the swamp, whatever expression they use, misses the point that they may not have any capacity to govern when they're there, which you've seen with Trump, you're seeing with Macron, in my view, and you would see it in this case if it was Hanson getting up in Queensland or Xenophon getting up in South Australia. They don't have the skill sets. I remember back to Jimmy Carter, and the euphoria with which he swept in from Georgia and took over Washington. It didn't last very long. That doesn't, because the institution's pretty entrenched, and it's, look, right now, Trump, okay, he sort of painted himself as an outsider, but he ran as a Republican. And the Republicans ended up with control of both houses. Yet Trump's incapacity to use that voting strength to deliver anything has been staggering. I mean, even Obamacare, which the abolition of Obamacare has been a cause célèbre of the Republican Party for 8 or 9 years, I suppose, and they've just built themselves almost to a crescendo about that. Yet when it came to it, he's had 3 goes at actually getting rid of it or changing it substantially, and even though I think that would be insane, but I mean, he hasn't been able to do it because he has not got the capacity. In fact, the American system domestically, the checks and balances are such that the restraint on the president are very real. The democratic process depends on those institutions, the institutional strength of the Congress, the independence of the judiciary, the fiercely independent media, and so on. And if those get broken down, of course, somebody like a Trump actually seems to have some influence for a time. But he's been able to do virtually nothing in the time he's been there that said he's wanted to do. He certainly hasn't got any closer to his main agenda on tax or infrastructure projects and so on. And he's going to find that a very difficult negotiating process as well. So, I mean, sometimes I think people want to believe that these outsiders can actually deliver, yet if they don't have the capacity to do that, I mean, that causes concern. But then, of course, they'll look at our system and see people who end up in major ministerial positions with zero skill set in that portfolio. No practical experience. Many of them have never had a real job. In fact, a high percentage of people coming into politics today have come out of university politics through a union or local government or, you know, the party organisation, minister's office or whatever, and end up in a major portfolio where they know nothing about it and are not prepared to take advice. In fact, because they're just playing a game with it. And that is a really weakness in the system that we can fix that. You can change pre-selection process, you can change everything, you know, but it takes time to do that. And I don't know how far we let these circumstances run before people go on the other side and say, hello, we've had enough, let's go back to substance here, you know, let's put in proper people that can do the job, experienced people and so on. But at this stage, we're still on the slippery slope down, I fear.
Speaking of time, we are running out of it, and so I wanted to acknowledge the questions that have been coming through on Twitter. There's an inherent irony to telling people to use the hashtag Integrity20 to ask questions like, does digital communication increase the spread of misinformation? But we have been influenced by those tweets in asking some questions. I'm going to give one now that's just straight from Twitter. Snoopy Boy asks, if truth is based on having factual evidence to support a belief, does that disregard a hunch that could possibly be true? What's the role of intuition? Does anyone want to jump in on that?
Professor of Philosophy.
Well, I'm happy to... So you might... Okay, so one really nice thing about these questions that are coming up is how they make you ask, well, what is the point of speech in the first place? To which a natural answer is, well, we say stuff because we want to communicate true things. That's a very naive, but it's part of a political basis for a principle of free speech that's there in Mill. So J.S. Mill, a founding figure in liberal political philosophy, said that truth is the goal of free speech. You shouldn't censor speech because it might be true, but also even the false stuff, there's room for just trying stuff out. This is where the hunches come in, because there's room for just trying stuff out, exploring stuff, and having it contested. The contestation is part of what John was mentioning before. But contestation assumes that there's a truth out there somewhere, and a hunch can be a way of trying something out to get to a truth. It's a good beginning, but you don't stay with it. That would be my first reaction to it. Yeah. Yeah,
and I'd say that intuitions, you know, I don't see this as a kind of a real problem, this distinction, because an intuition, you know, sort of almost by definition, you don't know whether it's true or not. You just have a feeling about it. And I mean, all of the statements that we think of when we think about facts, one of the most important things about them, and perhaps the most important thing about any statement, is that it could stand as a reason for something that we would want to do next, stand as a reason for a decision that we would want to make. And oftentimes the decisions that we have to make, we don't have the time or the inclination or the resources to kind of really figure out, you know, whether this is the right decision. And that's usually what we mean when we talk about intuitions, that we've got a feeling this is the right thing to do, we do it. Well, if the intuition is not true, we're going to quickly find out, right? If whatever it happens to be, the milk is sour, it's not going to taste good, or much more kind of consequential things than that. So, I mean, it also comes back to the science side of things where, you know, scientists wouldn't necessarily say they're reporting intuitions, but they would always say that what they're reporting is not, you know, all they've done is failed to falsify it. All they've done is been unable to say that it's false, but we're pretty confident. Right? So in terms of, yes, it might turn out not to be true, but for practical purposes, it's worth using it as a reason for the following things you might do. For example, medicines you might, you know, use to treat a condition or what have you.
Can I just say one thing? On the climate debate, one of the things that really frustrates me is that we've got a very unusual circumstance where 97%, I think, of peer-assessed climate scientists now agree on the magnitude and urgency of the problem. And they're supported by a host of other scientists and broader civil society and so on. And yet the deniers will question that. And now this is very unusual, as I said, for scientists, because naturally they don't usually agree. They disagree. The nature of science is to disagree, to contest each other. And here they are all agreeing. And why, as a non-scientist, would I want to question that? I find it just almost inconceivable. Just on truth, it was interesting, in my background as first-year accounting student at Sydney University, I was given one of the textbooks was Bertrand Russell's book. Was it called Inquiry into Meaning and Truth, something like that? Something like that. And so it had a lasting impact, you can tell. But I read it in detail and then never saw reference to truth again in my entire accounting experience.
But that's because it was taken for granted.
That's right.
I think it's a really interesting question, though. We've had the suggestion that maybe it's lack of awareness or lack of knowledge, but it seems to me that we're living in a time where most people probably do know that information that they're getting might not be true, but it doesn't seem to make a difference to people. Are there strategies of making people believe more in the idea of trusting evidence, for example? Can that be? Are there effective strategies for doing that today?
Can I say that's sort of part of what is post-truth as well, just referring back to that question, and then I'll address that, is the notion that post-truth is about what feels true rather than what is actually true. And so then you come to your question, which is, does it really matter if it's true or not? Do people care anymore whether it's really true, or do they care about other things more, such as, confirmation bias, reinforcement of their own existing points of view and so on? So are there strategies to get people to believe more? We first have to ask, or to trust more, we first have to ask, is truth actually really important to most people now? Or does it seem to be more important that, in fact, their existing worldviews and their existing narratives about refugees and sexism and those sorts of things are simply reinforced? And that's what a lot of the discussion around post-truth is really about.
Yeah.
I mean, I just have to say that truth, sometimes it's sort of, people say, truth matters less to people and so forth. I think for the reasons, that Rae started out with, and I also mentioned, truth matters very deeply to people, all the time. It's important to us to, we rely on the sort of outcomes of scientific findings and so forth in so many respects and in all sorts of ways. Truth matters a lot, and the whole kind of outcome of, I have an optimistic take on what might sort of happen here, and that is that once sort of people begin to register that more consciously in relation to this post-truth sort of moment that's happening now with the kind of media level, you might get trust in all of those sources of information going down and down and down, such that people, don't believe anything that they sort of see reported. But why I have an optimistic take on that is that that could be a good thing. It could instill in a sort of natural way the kind of critical thinking that we really need, where people will actually, the more things they question, the more likely people will be, the more likely it will be that people will look for a second source of information to support that sort of claim, the more likely they'll be to sort of evaluate, what that claim might lead to if they decide to then send that link to someone that they know and so forth. So it could, in an ideal world, lead to greater critical thinking, and I think that's something that we could probably sort of try to instigate if we could.
Rae, are you optimistic about the possibility of greater critical thinking as a sort of unintended consequence of the era of Brexit and Trump?
I think that's the optimistic version, and I guess the pessimistic version would be getting back to the story of the boy who cried wolf. If there's so much wolf crying by everybody all the time, and so that it's not actually ends up not being about wolves at all, because it's not really in the business of describing the world, but just sort of expressing some spontaneous feeling. I mean, if it could change the very nature of the speech acts that we're performing, if people substitute sounding off for communication, that would be the concern. I mean, I think the other side to your question that we haven't explored very much, which I think I'd love to know more about, is whether people, not just to do with the media and politics, but just in their own lives, care less about truth. So in philosophy, there are lots of times where we consider the possibility that we have a wonderful life, but it's based on a lie. So there's this thought experiment of an experience machine that you can step into. You can choose to step into it. You can design it. You're going to meet the perfect person in this matrix-like wonderful experience machine. If you want to learn to ski or play the piano, you can do all that stuff. But you have to decide. You're going to go into it. It's all going to be fake, but you'll be very happy if that's what you choose. And every year that I teach this thought experiment of the experience machine, I ask my students, how many people, well, let me do it here, how many people would step into the experience machine? You can just decide. And the numbers vary from year to year. So can I just have a show of hands? How many people would go for a happy life that was based on a lie? Hands up. Ah, now you see, I misdescribed it.
It's a lifetime commitment, is it?
Yeah. So my MIT students, the proportion would shift from year to year, and I was worried that it was starting to go up. Yeah.
You mentioned trust before, and these issues are so complex. We're sort of oversimplifying, taking elements of them, but one of the conundrums that worries me is that people can lose trust in the political system, and politicians and the process and so on. Yet those same people are quite happy to use an Uber car, but they don't know the car or the driver, and they trust them that they'll take them to where they want to go. Or Airbnb, we'll rent our house and we'll trust the people who rent it. I would think that's pretty high risk compared to some of the issues in the political process. But I've had a lot of trouble thinking about these issues over the years because we had quite a domineering father who wasn't very well educated at all. And he had very firm statements about just about everything, mostly based on prejudice. But he said to me, over and over, you should only ever believe 50% of what you see, 25% of what you read, and nothing of what you hear. So it's very difficult for me to think about these issues.
John, do you think that the idea of evidence needs to be sold better in politics? Because everyone says these days that their view is supported by a study that they've commissioned or a model. Is there a way out of that trap where everyone's just sort of compiling faux evidence?
Trump doesn't say it.
Trump's the one who doesn't, that's true, yeah.
Doesn't bother.
Yeah, look, I think there are players in civil society that have a role to actually, fact check or contest some of those positions. And I'm disappointed a lot of the time that academics will quite often in the staff room point out the weaknesses of an argument, but you won't hear them saying that on television and putting their reputations at risk. But I do think over time, you start to see the falsity of that sort of evidence. I mean, in the climate area, all the varying views all have their models. And all those models...
Yeah.
And, I used to teach macro modelling, and we'd start with a conclusion. What do we want to prove today? And that's what they do. And then we'll go back and see what assumptions we need to make it work. Yeah. And it comes back to judgment. You've got to make a judgment as to whether that's a realistic assessment or an alternative an alternative way of thinking about it.
We've only got time for one more question, unfortunately, but I'll give it to one of our questions from Twitter, so thanks again to our audience. Virginia Balfour asks a beautifully simple but hard question, I think. Who will be the new gatekeepers? Anyone like to answer that?
I sort of feel like it is a little bit, everything's a little bit sort of loose at the moment, in society. I think, you know, I'm a media researcher, so I would say that the media will always be an important, I don't know if they'll be gatekeepers, but they'll certainly always be an important watchdog. For me, there's the media that exists, you know, the traditional media that we talked about, legacy media, and then there's another group of media that I sort of work with as well, you know, community media and alternative media. And in fact, it's that part of the media landscape that is often the best watcher. You know, they watch the watchdog. They're the part of the media landscape that is critiquing media and critiquing the watchdog. Don't know if that's a gatekeeper, but certainly watchdog more so than other parts. The media itself, particularly the Australian media, is not very self-reflective, you know, and certainly not very self-critical. But you do find in other parts of the media landscape some really good critique of media and watching the watchers. And so I think there's great hope in certain parts of our media landscape that there is somebody watching both
sort of
the mainstream media.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nick?
Yeah, it's a good question, and as you say, a hard one. But what I would say here is that, you know, a gate assumes a path, and a path, you know, the path of these assertions and you know, these beliefs and so forth is a long one that goes through all sorts of channels, and that's part of why social media has kind of transformed everything. But whether it's social media or everyday life or whatever it is, part of that path is our minds, our brains, basically. So, you know, it's our attention. All of this economy of information and so forth is grabbing our attention. It's playing on our, you know, our biases. It's making us kind of take these things and run with them and send them on and so forth. So no matter what's going on, the path of all of this, you know, truth and post-truth and lies and bullshit, etc., is going through us as individuals. So, you know, I'm with those people who say, actually, there's no hope of having any kind of gatekeeper anymore, you know, given the way that sort of media and information flow is. So the only thing to do now is to work on ourselves.
DIY gatekeeping?
DIY.
Right.
I feel that the way the media is working now is a de facto set of very severe gatekeepers. That is to say, the most stringent gatekeeping is not being done by governments and intentional agents at all. It's being done by algorithms that create echo chambers, which are de facto forms of censorship, where we don't get to hear the views of people unlike ourselves. And so we're in exactly the situation that Mill feared when he was concerned about the alien ideas being squashed, which might well turn out to be true. So I think the biggest gatekeepers that we're living with right now are ones that are not even meaning to be gatekeepers.
Well, those echo chambers sound terrible, but it's been a great pleasure being in this echo chamber with you today and with everyone here this morning. Unfortunately, we do have to wrap it up now. So, ladies and gentlemen, please thank our panel today. John Hewson, Rae Langton, Nick Enfield, and Susan Forde.